January 7, 1945. Zonhoven, Belgium. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands before reporters. The Battle of the Bulge is still raging. German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes 3 weeks ago, striking American positions and creating chaos behind Allied lines. Montgomery is about to hold a press conference. He's in good spirits, confident, almost jovial. He's been given temporary command of American forces north of the German breakthrough. He believes he handled the situation brilliantly. Now he's going to tell the press about it. What Montgomery says in the next hour will create the worst crisis in Anglo-American relations of World War II. His words will infuriate American generals, create demands for his removal, and nearly split the Allied coalition. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill will have to perform emergency damage control to save the alliance. This is the story of what Churchill said when Montgomery took credit for saving the Americans, how Montgomery's press conference nearly destroyed Allied unity, and how Churchill's intervention in Parliament prevented a catastrophic rupture between Britain and America. 3 weeks earlier, on December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. 28 German divisions struck thinly held American positions, creating a huge bulge in the Allied lines. The German attack caught American forces by surprise. Some American units were overrun. Others fought desperate defensive battles. Chaos spread through the area as Germans advanced rapidly westward. The weather was terrible, preventing Allied air support from operating effectively. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had to respond quickly. He made several crucial decisions in the first days of the battle. Eisenhower immediately recognized the German offensive as a major threat, not just a local attack. On December 20, 1944, Eisenhower made a command decision that would have major consequences. He gave Montgomery temporary command of all Allied forces north of the German breakthrough, including the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. Eisenhower's reasoning was practical. The German attack had split American forces. Communications between General Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the U.S. 1st Army in Belgium were difficult. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was closer to 1st Army and could coordinate more effectively. This was purely a tactical decision based on geography and communications. It was temporary and didn't reflect any judgment about American versus British command competence. Eisenhower trusted both Bradley and Montgomery as commanders, but Montgomery saw it differently. He believed he'd been given command of American forces because British leadership was needed to fix an American failure. Montgomery had always been convinced of British military superiority. This command change seemed to confirm his views. American generals were outraged when they read Montgomery's statements. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, was particularly angry. Bradley had fought the entire battle with most of his forces. He'd made crucial decisions to hold key positions and organize counterattacks. Bradley considered Montgomery's statements a personal insult and a gross distortion of what had happened. He telephoned Eisenhower with an extraordinary threat. If Montgomery was not immediately removed from command of American forces, Bradley would resign. This was a major crisis. Bradley was one of Eisenhower's most important commanders. His resignation would be catastrophic. It would suggest deep problems with Allied command structure and could shake confidence in the entire war effort. General George Patton recorded his fury in his diary on January 8. Patton wrote that Montgomery was trying to steal credit for an American battle, and that British command had contributed nothing significant to the victory. Patton had moved 3rd Army north in record time to relieve Bastogne. His forces had fought continuously in terrible weather. American newspapers published angry responses. American military correspondents and editorial writers condemned Montgomery's claims as inaccurate and insulting. The New York Times, Washington Post, and other major papers ran editorials questioning Montgomery's version of events. The crisis quickly escalated beyond military circles. The U.S. War Department in Washington received protests from Congress and from the American public. Politicians demanded that American forces be removed from British command immediately. The American press questioned whether British commanders understood modern warfare. Some editorials suggested Montgomery's appointment had been a mistake from the beginning. Others wondered if British generals were trying to diminish American contributions to the war. American soldiers who had fought in the Bulge were particularly angry. They'd endured freezing temperatures, heavy casualties, and desperate fighting. Now a British general was claiming he'd saved them by tidying up their mess. Eisenhower faced an impossible situation. He was caught between his British and American subordinates. If he publicly contradicted Montgomery, he would create a rift with Britain. If he remained silent, American commanders would revolt. Eisenhower knew the truth. American forces had borne the overwhelming burden of the battle. Montgomery's role had been important but secondary. British forces had provided backup and insurance, not the main fighting effort. But Eisenhower also knew that Allied unity was essential. The war wasn't over. Germany still had to be defeated. Any public split between American and British commanders would encourage the enemy and demoralize Allied troops. Eisenhower tried to manage the crisis quietly. He spoke with Bradley and Patton, asking them to be patient. He contacted British commanders, expressing his displeasure with Montgomery's statements, but the crisis was too public to contain. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill learned of the crisis within days. Churchill was informed that Montgomery's press conference had created serious damage to Anglo-American relations. Reports from Washington indicated real anger at the highest levels of American government. Churchill understood the danger immediately. His Chief of Staff Alan Brooke recorded in his diary that Churchill was furious with Montgomery for creating this problem. Brooke himself was embarrassed by Montgomery's behavior. Britain depended on American partnership to win the war. The United States provided the majority of forces, equipment, and supplies for the Allied effort in Europe. Without American support, Britain couldn't defeat Germany. Montgomery's ego threatened that partnership. Churchill decided he had to intervene personally and publicly to repair the damage. A private message to American leaders wouldn't be enough. The damage was public, so the repair had to be public as well. On January 18, 1945, Churchill addressed the House of Commons. Churchill gave a speech specifically addressing the Battle of the Bulge and Anglo-American cooperation. The speech was calculated to tear the damage Montgomery had caused. Churchill knew he had to explicitly praise American forces and make clear that they, not Montgomery, had won the battle. He had to do this without directly attacking Montgomery, which would create other problems. It required careful diplomatic language. Churchill said, "I have seen it suggested that the terrific battle which has been proceeding since December 16 on the American front is an Anglo-American battle. In fact, however, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses." This opening statement immediately corrected the false impression created by Montgomery's press conference. Churchill wasn't suggesting it was an Anglo-American battle. He was stating flatly that it was an American battle. Churchill continued, "They have suffered losses almost equal to those on both sides in the Battle of Gettysburg. Only one British Army corps has been engaged in this action. All the rest of the 30 or more divisions which have been fighting continuously for the last month are United States troops." These words directly contradicted the impression Montgomery's press conference had created. Churchill was making clear that this was an American battle, not a British one. The reference to Gettysburg was significant. Churchill was comparing the Battle of the Bulge to the most famous battle in American history. Churchill went further. He said, "The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours." This was Churchill using specific numbers to emphasize the American contribution and minimize any British claim to credit. The numbers were devastating to any argument that Britain had saved the Americans. Then Churchill addressed Montgomery's role directly, but diplomatically. He said, "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." The phrase "care must be taken" was a rebuke to Montgomery. Without naming him, Churchill was saying that British claims like Montgomery's had gone too far and needed to be corrected. The phrase "our proud tales" acknowledged British contributions while insisting they not be exaggerated. Churchill continued by praising General Eisenhower specifically. He said, "I have been shocked to hear suggestions that the Supreme Commander General Eisenhower has been overruled by the British, or that his judgment has been questioned. General Eisenhower has conducted this battle with great skill and determination. This was crucial. Churchill was publicly endorsing Eisenhower and rejecting any suggestion that British commanders knew better than the American Supreme Commander. Montgomery had implied that his superior leadership had been necessary. Churchill was contradicting that implication. Churchill emphasized that Eisenhower's command decisions had been sound. The temporary transfer of American forces to Montgomery's command had been Eisenhower's decision, made for practical reasons, not because American leadership had failed. Churchill concluded this section of his speech by saying, "Let no one lend himself to the chatter of mischief-makers when issues of this momentous consequence are being successfully decided by sword. I have complete confidence in General Eisenhower." The phrase "chatter of mischief-makers" was another indirect reference to Montgomery and others who had exaggerated British contributions. Churchill was dismissing their claims as harmful noise that threatened Allied unity. The speech was reported extensively in British and American newspapers. American reactions were positive. Churchill's words helped calm the crisis. American newspapers praised Churchill for setting the record straight. The Washington Post published an editorial thanking Churchill for his honesty and fairness. The New York Times called Churchill's speech a model of Allied statesmanship. American political leaders expressed appreciation for Churchill's clear recognition of American accusation, but the damage from Montgomery's press conference wasn't completely repaired. American generals never fully trusted Montgomery again after this incident. General Bradley wrote that Montgomery's Belgian press conference had convinced him that Montgomery was not only personally arrogant, but also a menace to Allied unity. Bradley's opinion mattered. He would command American forces in Europe through the end of the war. His distrust of Montgomery affected how he worked with British forces. Bradley became much more protective of American command authority. General Patton wrote in his diary on January 19, after Churchill's speech, "Churchill tried to fix what Monty broke, but we won't forget." Patton's words reflected the view of many American commanders. Churchill's speech had helped, but the underlying resentment remained. Montgomery had revealed his true attitude toward American leadership, and American generals wouldn't forget it. Even Eisenhower, who tried to maintain good relations with Montgomery, was frustrated. Eisenhower wrote that Montgomery's press conference was an unnecessary complication at a critical time. Eisenhower had enough problems managing the war, without dealing with public relations disasters created by his subordinates. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Montgomery's superior and supporter, was also critical. Brooke wrote in his diary that Monty's press conference was a mistake, and that he should never have claimed so much credit. Brooke understood that Montgomery had damaged British-American relations for no good reason. What about Montgomery himself? In his memoirs published in 1958, Montgomery maintained that his press conference had been misunderstood. He wrote that he had meant to praise American soldiers, and that the controversy was blown out of proportion by sensitive Americans. Montgomery claimed that his words had been taken out of context by hostile journalists and oversensitive American generals. He suggested that the entire controversy was a misunderstanding based on cultural differences between British and American communication styles. This defense missed the point entirely. The problem wasn't that Americans misunderstood Montgomery. The problem was that they understood him perfectly. Montgomery had claimed credit for an American battle. His words revealed his belief in British superiority over American leadership. This showed Montgomery never fully understood the damage he'd caused or why his words were so offensive. Montgomery genuinely believed he had handled the battle brilliantly and deserved credit for it. He couldn't understand why Americans resented his. Churchill's intervention in Parliament on January 18, 1945, was necessary emergency damage control. Without Churchill's speech explicitly crediting American forces and praising Eisenhower, the alliance might have suffered permanent damage. Churchill understood what Montgomery apparently did not, that the relationship between Britain and America was based on mutual respect, and that British claims to superior leadership over American forces would poison that relationship. The alliance worked because both nations recognized each other's contributions and respected each other's commanders. Montgomery's press conference violated this understanding. Churchill had to restore it publicly and clearly. The consequences of Montgomery's press conference extended beyond the immediate crisis. American military leaders became much more cautious about placing American forces under British command. In the final months of the war, Eisenhower made sure that American forces remained under American commanders whenever possible. The temporary command arrangement that had put American armies under Montgomery during the Bulge was not repeated. American generals also became more assertive about American strategy. When Montgomery proposed various operational plans in early 1945, American commanders scrutinized them carefully and frequently offered alternative plans. The trust that had existed before the press conference never fully returned. British commanders noticed this change. They found American generals less willing to accept British suggestions and more insistent on American approaches to military problems. The partnership continued, but it was more difficult. Montgomery himself faced consequences. Churchill had saved Montgomery from being relieved of command, but Montgomery's influence declined. Eisenhower listened to other advisers more and to Montgomery less. When the final campaigns of the war were planned, Montgomery's suggestions carried less weight. American commanders had lost confidence in his judgment, not about military matters, but about his ability to work effectively in an Allied command structure. What Churchill said when Montgomery took credit for saving the Americans is preserved word for word in the parliamentary record. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. These words were a direct rebuke to Montgomery's claims, a recognition of American sacrifice, and an attempt to repair damaged Anglo-American relations. Churchill also said, "The United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours." These statistics demolished any British claim to having saved the Americans in the Bulge. The numbers were clear and irrefutable. American forces had borne the overwhelming burden of the battle. The historical record shows that Churchill's intervention worked. American anger began to subside after Churchill's speech. The alliance held together. The war continued with Britain and America fighting as partners, but Montgomery remained a problem. Eisenhower seriously considered asking for Montgomery to be removed after the press conference incident. Only Churchill's personal intervention with Eisenhower prevented Montgomery's relief from command. Churchill spoke privately with Eisenhower, acknowledging that Montgomery had been wrong, and promising that it wouldn't happen again. Churchill asked Eisenhower to keep Montgomery in command for the sake of Allied unity. Eisenhower agreed, but the relationship was damaged. Churchill had to choose between defending his difficult field marshal and maintaining the Anglo-American alliance. He chose the alliance. His parliamentary speech threw Montgomery under the bus, diplomatically, but unmistakably to preserve relations with America. This was Churchill at his best, recognizing a crisis, understanding what needed to be said, and saying it clearly and effectively. His words saved the alliance that Montgomery's ego had nearly destroyed. Churchill understood that Britain's future depended on maintaining strong relations with America. The war would be won or lost based on Allied cooperation. Personal loyalties to subordinates couldn't be allowed to threaten that cooperation. The Battle of the Bulge press conference became a defining moment in understanding Montgomery's character and Churchill's diplomatic skill. Montgomery could win battles but couldn't resist claiming excessive credit. Churchill could manage difficult allies and repair damaged branches. What Churchill said when Montgomery took credit for saving the Americans was exactly what needed to be said. The truth stated clearly, with proper credit given to those who deserved it, and with enough diplomatic skill to fix the problem without making it worse. Churchill's speech demonstrated the qualities that made him an effective wartime leader. He could be tough when necessary, diplomatic when required, and always kept his focus on the larger goal of winning the war and maintaining Allied unity. The speech also demonstrated Churchill's understanding of America. He knew that Americans valued recognition of their contributions and resented any suggestion that they needed British leadership to succeed. Churchill gave Americans the recognition they deserved and corrected the false impression Montgomery had created.